Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to Go Big and Go Homeschool. My name is Maggie. I'm the homeschooling mama of 10, and we're in our 18th year of homeschooling. As you can imagine, finding time for my own reading is not always easy, but it has become a higher priority over the last few years, and I've also become more organized, something that I never was in my younger adult years. I just read whatever came across my path, but I have really enjoyed planning and making my own mother culture skole life, which is a fancy way of saying moms are people too, and we need to take responsibility for our own souls and our own educations as well. So this year for Christmas, I bought myself the Literary Life Commonplace book. And as I was putting that in my cart, my son was looking over my shoulder and I said, "Hey, do you want to join me in this year's challenge and listen to the podcast with me?" To my surprise, he said yes. And I went ahead and bought children's versions for all the other kids. My son and I will both be doing the adult challenge. Now, we might not necessarily be reading all of the same books because the way the Literary Life Challenge works is that they give you categories and then you plug your own books into those categories. Super fun, super flexible. But whenever possible, I like for my choices to be ones that I know are going to be discussed on the podcast because I have just been so enriched and challenged and had my literary ceiling just blown off by listening to this podcast faithfully for the last few years. And I've really expanded into books that I would not have picked up on my own, even books that I hated and learned to love. So I'm excited for my son. He is not a self-described book lover, but I can occasionally find him delving into a cool series on his own. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he chooses. Of course, some I have chosen for him because they were just in his school curriculum for the year. So here are the categories for 22. This year's challenge is called 2 for 22 because each category has 2 books. The first one is 2 poets from the Well-Read Poem podcast. This is another podcast that we've really enjoyed listening to every day. I especially appreciate the well-read poem because my sons have mostly been exposed to me reading them poetry. It is not my best skill, and I think that they really appreciate hearing a man's voice. Thomas Banks does a great job of reading this poetry and expounding on it. So we will not be choosing 11 poems from one poet and 11 poems from another like we're supposed to. I think we're just going to listen whenever we get a chance during morning time. Chances are we'll listen to way more than 22 poems. The next category is a favorite author of your favorite author. I have a lot of favorite authors, but hands down, C.S. Lewis is my oldest and dearest literary friend. And his favorite author, of course, he had many, but everybody agrees that the pivotal moment in C.S. Lewis's spiritual and literary journey was picking up Phantastes by George MacDonald. I went ahead and got myself this collection of some George MacDonald works. Last year, I began Phantastes, and it was an audio version, and I really did not like the narrator. I liked the book, but I just decided after several chapters I could not hang with that narrator anymore, and I gave up. Went ahead and got myself a physical copy. I am a little more tempted by The Princess and the Goblin than I am Phantastes, so we'll see where I go. My other choice for this category is The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. I chose this partly because I can plug it into another category, and we'll get to that later. For my biography category, I'm struggling to find somebody living. And for someone dead, I chose Never Give In, which is about Winston Churchill, handed to me by a friend many years ago, never got around to reading it, and I still need a living biography. So I love your ideas. Tell me who you enjoyed reading about if the person is still living. I was thinking maybe Elon Musk. I don't know. For the Victorian novel category, I went ahead with a book that will be covered on the podcast, Hard Times by Charles Dickens. I am really not a Dickens fan, but I'm trying, and I trust the fine folks on the Literary Life to help me understand and enjoy this book more than I would if I were to pick it up on my own. So that's for my man author. For a woman author, I have The Scent of Water by Elizabeth Gouge. Never read Elizabeth Gouge. She's highly recommended by many. So that might actually be the next book that I read. In the drama category, I needed a comedy and a tragedy. And of course, both are going to be Shakespeare. The kids and I are in the middle of Midsummer Night's Dream right now. This is our second time going through. It's just such a fun play to study with children. And this time we are really getting into it. I bought my daughter some little paper characters that she colored, and we mounted them on popsicle sticks so that they can do narration that way and tell the story. We've also watched a movie version, and we're working on memorizing The Lunatic, the Lover, and the Poet. Previously, we memorized another short passage, so this is a little new, a little different, and a little bit longer. For the tragedy, I chose King Lear for myself. I am a fan of No Fear Shakespeare. I know that there is always a temptation to stick with the side that's in plain English and kind of ruin Shakespeare for yourself. I challenge myself to only look at the plain English side if absolutely necessary, and I'm always thankful that it's there if I need it. I chose King Lear because I think that there is a movie version with Anthony Hopkins. The next category is probably my favorite, and that is inklings. For those who don't know, the inklings were a group of some of the greatest minds of literature who used to meet in smoky old pubs and just drink loads of beer and talk about their books. Tolkien, Lewis, Dorothy Sayers, and many others came and went from the inklings over the years. So the two categories that we have here are by an inkling and about an inkling. Now, I have a lot of inklings books on my shelves. The one that I'm most excited about is the Andy Serkis Audible version of The Fellowship of the Ring. This is something my son and I are going to listen to together. Andy Serkis is the guy who played Gollum in the Lord of the Rings movies, and he has narrated The Fellowship of the Ring. So that will fit in our by an inkling category. I also will be reading Abolition of Man, and I'm deciding whether or not I'm going to have my son read it as well as assigned school. This is my third reading through Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. Every time I get something new from it, and it will be covered on the podcast this year. The book that I chose for my category about an inkling, and that is The Light from Behind the Sun, A Reformed and Evangelical Appreciation of C.S. Lewis by Douglas Wilson. It seems to tackle some issues that a lot of people struggle with surrounding Lewis. The next category is called International. 2 books set in a country other than yours. I happened to be at my dad's house when I was filling in my list, and so I just grabbed stuff off his shelves. Really don't know anything about them, but I'm looking forward to them. I have Tent Life in Siberia and a Tony Hillerman, Finding Moon. This is set all over the world from what I can gather in the description. It also will fit in another category. I'll tell you about that in a minute. For my history, biography, topical category, I needed 2 books with opposing perspectives. I really love this challenge. And for this one, I'm going to do Everlasting Man by Chesterton, which of course is doubled up from the favorite author of your favorite author category. And against that, I'm going to read Outlines of History by H.G. Wells. From my understanding, Everlasting Man was written in response to Outlines of History, and I haven't read much Wells in the past. It's so hard to define classic literature, isn't it? That's the next category, classic literature. For my new read, and chose Northanger Abbey. because I've got to give Jane Austen another shot. And I know that she was covered in the podcast a few years ago. I can always go back and listen to that. And for my reread, I have Wind in the Willows. This is one that is also in my kids' challenge. Truthfully, Wind in the Willows is such a rich and deep book that it could definitely count for an adult challenge. But as far as I can remember, only my grown adult children have read this with me. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with all the kiddos that I have at home now. This is a little outside my normal comfort zone, a detective murder mystery. And for these two choices, I need a golden age detective novel and a contemporary detective novel. Of course, my contemporary one will already be filled by this Tony Hillerman book. I have so many choices for the golden age. I went ahead and got Death on the Nile, which could also fit in the international category. And when I was shopping on my mom's shelves earlier this year, I know that I put many Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie's in the box. My mom hasn't mailed it yet, so I can't remember which ones they were. If I find that I really love this category, I might read several. I've got to admit something. I chose this particular Agatha Christie because I know it's been made into a movie. And what that means is I can open up the cast of characters on my phone and look at their faces, and it just helps me keep track of who's who without actually watching the movie. Now, I do intend to watch the movie after I've read the book, but in the past, reading Agatha Christie has kind of gotten me bogged down with all of the characters, so that's a good way for me to just kind of keep my head above water and know who's who. For the final category, I have essays. 11 essays from past decades or centuries, 11 essays from this century. So for the past decades and centuries, I have English critical essays, which has been on my shelves for years. Truthfully, just as decoration, because it's kind of a cute, pretty little old book. And it does look quite challenging. I'm not even sure it has 11 essays in it. But I am going to challenge myself to read 11 this year. And for 11 essays from this century, I'm going to try to find a book I lost and began for a challenge a couple of years ago, and that was one by Chesterton. I can't even remember the name, but I was really enjoying it. So I'm going to look through all of my shelves and see if I can find that Chesterton collection of essays, and that will wrap up my challenge for the year. Of course, I have many other books in my to-be-read list, which is another section in my commonplace book. There's never enough room in these. There are so many wonderful books on my shelves. If you're struggling to find the time to read, mamas, I would just encourage you to make it a priority and ask for your family to help you. One way that I have managed to read a lot of books, pardon me, I found the coffee that I was missing earlier. Anyway, one way that I have found that I can manage to get through a lot of books that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to, there are many great options for getting free audiobooks through your public library. Hoopla, Overdrive, Libby are some of your choices. A lot of classic and public domain books can be found there, as well as LibriVox. And of course, there's always Audible through Amazon, Scribd. Those are all great places to find audiobooks. Many on my list this year will be audiobooks because then I can walk or drive or do laundry or dishes while I am absorbing a great book. If I find that I'm really struggling to find time to read, one of the first things that I do is take Facebook off my phone, and woo! It seems that I have much more time than I thought I did. I like to try to keep one of the books on my list in the car in case I'm caught at an appointment that's running long. And I keep little stacks of these around the house in the places where I know that I might be having some free time, like my bedside table, or if I manage to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning, which I've challenged myself to do on a regular basis this year. I just keep a few of the books, in a stack ready to go so I'm not looking around the house for whichever one I'm currently reading. And I like to give myself a few options in case I'm just not really in the mood for the one that I started. In the past, I like to only read one book at a time, but I have found for me it's working to have a few books going at once typically a really light and fun one next to a really challenging or heavy one so that I can just read according to my mood. I can't wait to make a video about the kids' literary life books and the choices that we have plugged into their categories for the Kids Challenge this year. One more thing. Okay, I know this is becoming a bad habit where I end a video and then I think of more than I want to say. I had my son bring me up his Literary Life Commonplace book. This is the adult version, different cover for him. And I kind of wanted to tell you a couple of the choices that we have for him in the adult category. Because his is not exactly the same as mine. For the Victorian novel, The Woman Author, this isn't a genre that he is familiar with. I don't think he's read much Victorian literature at all. So I chose for him a book that I read last year for the challenge, and that was Silas Marner. In my opinion, this is a great start for high schoolers in Victorian literature. It's rather short. It's a really fast-moving, engaging tale. The characters are really rich, so I think he's going to enjoy that one. For some of these categories, we went ahead and plugged in some children's books. He still does have quite a bit of reading outside of this challenge to complete, and I didn't want this to feel like a burden to him. So for many of these categories, we went ahead and plugged in some of the children's books that the other kids have in their challenge. For the 2 books with opposing perspectives, I went ahead and got him On Guard by William Lane Craig. This was a hugely influential and useful book to my now graduated adult children. To oppose that, I'm going to go ahead and get him The God Delusion by Dawkins and just give him a good perspective on those opposing views. I have many other books on my shelf that would fit into that category that are kind of in the apologetics realm. So if these don't work out for him, I know that I have a lot of other choices, but this is something that I want to give him this year because it's a topic that interests him and he has a lot of questions about the nature of the universe and God's existence and all of those things. So I'm really looking forward to that category with him. For the detective category, I remember loving the Westing Game when I was his age, so I bought him a copy of the Westing Game. It's short, it's fun, it's easy. I think he'll really like that. It's okay. I really am done with this video now. Goodbye. Go homeschool.